The truth is, nothing about that morning inside the royal walls felt normal, not even close. Before sunrise, the corridors weren't just quiet, they felt sealed off, like the building itself was holding its breath. Phones removed, conversations cut short, staff redirected without explanation, and somewhere deep inside that silence, a decision was forming that would not stay private for long. It started as what they called an estate discussion, but those who understand how power actually moves knew better. Estate discussions don't usually rewrite emotional boundaries inside a family. They don't usually decide which children become the future's priority while another branch quietly loses ground. Yet that is exactly what was unfolding here. Because when the so-called Sussex financial structure came under review, it wasn't treated like routine paperwork. It was handled like a live wire, a risk, a fracture point. And once that language enters a room like that, nothing stays emotional anymore. Everything becomes calculated. Inside that room, Charles didn't behave like a man signing a document. He behaved like someone weighing a consequence that had been building for years. The file wasn't just read, it was studied like it had history written inside its margins. Every pause felt loaded. Every silence felt like it had already decided something before he even spoke. And then came the shift no one was fully prepared for. What was once positioned as a bridge between two branches of the family was no longer being treated as connection. It was being treated as exposure, something that could no longer remain unchanged. And that is where everything tilted, because the redirection wasn't just financial on paper. It carried emotional weight that no one in that room could pretend not to feel. The beneficiaries being named weren't strangers. They were the next generation already living under the shadow of expectation George, Charlotte, and Louis names that suddenly stopped sounding like children and started sounding like institutional direction. William didn't celebrate. That's the detail nobody expected. There was no victory in his posture, no relief in his expression. Instead, there was something heavier, the kind of silence that comes when understanding replaces reaction. He knew exactly what was being protected and exactly what was being pushed further away in the process, because the real tension wasn't the money, it was the message underneath it. And that message was loud enough that even silence couldn't cover it. Meanwhile, Charles sat with the clause that made everything legally possible. Future safeguarding, a phrase that sounded harmless on paper, almost administrative. But in that room, it didn't feel like policy. It felt like a verdict that had been delayed for years and finally found its moment to speak. Future safeguarding meant one thing in practice: whatever comes next must be insulated from whatever came before. And once that logic enters a royal system, reconciliation stops being a hope and starts becoming a risk. That's when the witnesses became part of the story. Camilla was present. William was present. A senior advisor was present. And suddenly, this wasn't just a private adjustment anymore. It was a documented moment that could never fully return to secrecy. Because once names are attached to decisions like this, the decision stops belonging to intention and starts belonging to history. And somewhere in all of this, Harry was not in the room, but he was everywhere in the decision. Because the moment that clause activated, the emotional direction of the entire family shifted. What once felt like a bridge began to feel like a separation already finalized in all but announcement. And the hardest part, no one said it out loud in the moment. It was all done through language that sounded calm enough to deny panic, but precise enough to avoid reversal. Camilla noticed it first, the absence of certain names being repeated, the way the air changed when Harry wasn't referenced in the same structural context anymore. It wasn't what was said, it was what stopped being said. And that's where the deeper fracture began, because long before signatures, before clauses, before estate language, there had already been a dinner, a private April conversation that everyone still remembers differently depending on who was asked. Harry demanding protection without internal control, William refusing to separate responsibility from structure, Charles watching both sons speak the same language but mean completely different realities. And in that moment, something inside the family stopped moving forward together. It split. Quietly, permanently, without announcement. The settlement dinner, as it was later called internally, didn't end with resolution. It ended with silence so complete that it felt like a door had closed without anyone touching it. And after that night, nothing inside the estate conversations was neutral again. Everything was now either repair or protection. And protection, as it turned out, was chosen. The real collapse of tone didn't happen in the palace press room or on any official statement. It happened later in fragments when the private communication finally reached Harry. Not through spectacle, not through media noise, but through a controlled message delivered with surgical precision. The kind of message designed not to provoke reaction, but to prevent negotiation. And still, it hit like impact. Because what he heard wasn't just that the trust arrangement had changed. What he understood instantly was far more personal. The structure of expectation inside the family had been rewritten without him in the room. The language was careful, almost polite, but beneath it was something colder, finality, and that's when the emotional weight shifted completely. Harry didn't react loudly at first. There was no immediate public response, no dramatic escalation, just stillness. The kind that signals a mind trying to process something that refuses to feel temporary. Because money inside this family was never just money. It was alignment. It was positioning. It was proximity to the center. And now that proximity felt reduced. Meghan, standing beside him during the delivery of the message, understood it faster than anyone else. She didn't need interpretation. She saw the structure immediately. This wasn't a financial adjustment in isolation. This was a symbolic repositioning, a message about where each branch now stood in relation to the future. And she said, with the silence inside the room refused to say, this would not stay private for long. Not because someone leaked it deliberately, but because decisions like this always find their way into public interpretation. And once that happens, meaning stops being controlled. Harry, however, wasn't thinking about public interpretation yet. He was still stuck inside the private timeline. The April dinner, the tone of William's voice, the moment Charles placed his glass down instead of responding immediately. All of it replaying, not as memory, but as pattern, as if every step had already been pointing here. When William finally spoke to him directly, without aides, without filters, the conversation didn't bring relief. It clarified positions that neither brother wanted to fully accept. William framed it as protection of the next generation, not exclusion. But Harry heard something else underneath it, not protection, but replacement logic. A future being structured where his branch was no longer central to continuity planning. And that word continuity carried more weight than anything else. Because continuity inside a monarchy is not emotional language. It is structural language. It decides who is built into tomorrow and who is assumed to exist outside it. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His restraint only made the emotional gap wider. Harry, on the other side of the call, didn't hold back. Every sentence carried years of accumulated perception. Every pause filled with interpretations of distance, loyalty, and belonging. But the most important detail wasn't what was argued. It was what wasn't resolved. Because neither brother could move the decision backward. The clause had already been activated. The signatures already existed. The structure had already shifted from possibility to record. And inside that reality, even disagreement felt powerless. Charles, in the background of all this, was not presented as triumphant. That's what made the situation more complicated. He wasn't acting like a strategist closing a file. He was acting like someone absorbing the weight of irreversibility. Every administrative term, future safeguarding, estate instruction, restricted archive, carried emotional consequences he could not fully escape. Camilla saw it most clearly. Not the authority, but the fatigue. The kind that doesn't come from making decisions, but from knowing each decision removes a different version of the future. Because once the Sussex file moved into restricted handling, something subtle changed inside the palace ecosystem. It stopped being an active bridge. It became history being managed. And history, once managed, stops offering reconciliation as an option. Outside the palace walls, the transition from private decision to public narrative happened faster than anyone inside had prepared for. Headlines didn't wait for nuance. They simplified everything into direction. Who gained? Who lost? Who was centered? Who was pushed outward? And in that simplification, emotional complexity disappeared. What remained was interpretation. William saw the public reaction not as confirmation, but as distortion. He understood how quickly intention becomes narrative once it leaves private control. Catherine, on the other hand, focused on the children, because once their names entered the public frame, innocence stopped being automatic. It became something that needed protection from meaning itself. Charles stayed silent longer than expected, not because he had nothing to say, but because anything said too quickly risked turning explanation into justification. And justification, in this context, would only deepen fracture. So the silence held. But silence inside a monarchy is never empty. It accumulates. Harry felt that accumulation differently. Not as policy, but as distance that could no longer be mistaken for temporary strain. The emotional translation of the decision was simple. Even if the structure behind it wasn't, the center had moved, and he was no longer positioned within it. And once that realization settles, it doesn't ask permission to stay. stay. It just remains. In the end, nothing about the trust redirection functioned as a single event. It functioned as a sequence dinner: disagreement, clause, signature, communication, interpretation, exposure, each step reinforcing the last until the outcome no longer felt sudden, only inevitable in hindsight. And even then, the hardest truth wasn't about money or structure or protocol. It was about permanence. Because inside a family built on legacy, being repositioned doesn't feel like adjustment. It feels like being written differently into the future. And that is where the silence still sits, unfinished, unresolved, and far from over.